Well, tomorrow I get my second vaccine. I hope you soon get yours. I know Father David has. And I have this hope because perhaps then people will feel safer coming back to church. Of course, that is the real question. Will they return? Perhaps people have gotten comfortable just lounging around at home on Sunday morning. And maybe the more challenging question for our parish and for the church as a whole is why? Why should people come here on a Sunday morning? Does our faith in Christ offer them and us and our world something of meaning and value that can be found nowhere else? That's the really hard question to grapple with. Now, I'm convinced that it's only when we begin to understand the meaning of Jesus' resurrection and live from its power that the church will become attractive to people again. Now, today's gospel, this story of Jesus appearing to his terrified disciples and to Thomas, can help us gain some insight into the meaning of the resurrection and what it looks like when we live from its power. So I want to dive into this passage. But it's such a familiar passage, but at the same time, so rich. I love this story. It may be my favorite story in the whole New Testament. But it's so familiar that in order to really understand it, in order for its riches to unfold, we have to look at it through the eyes of the Jewish hopes expressed by the great prophets of Israel. So a little background to dive into the meaning of this passage. Ancient Israel lived through so many conflicts, internal conflicts, but most often attacks from powerful pagan empires. One empire after another, until eventually the Babylonian Empire destroyed Jerusalem, destroyed the temple, and deported most of the people. And these experiences led Israel's great prophets to express a hope that one day God would bring about an age of peace, where the weapons of war are turned into implements for farming. They long for God's age of peace rather than a world of hostility. And they believe that when this age of peace dawned, relationships would be renewed and restored. There would be reconciliation among peoples and between God and God's people. Things would be made whole again. Now, when Israel broke God's covenant and Israel's people scattered, they began to hope that God would forgive the nation and gather them back together, offer them a new covenant, give them new hearts, and pour God's Spirit into God's people. Ezekiel speaks beautifully about this divine heart surgery, that God will take out our hearts of stone and give us living hearts filled with God's life and Spirit. And finally, through the prophet Isaiah, you hear God promising to raise up God's people and to create one day a new heaven and a new earth. Now, are you with me here? They hope for an age of peace. They hope for the restoration of God's people. They hope for a new heaven and a new earth. So when Jesus appears in the upper room to those terrified disciples, all of those hopes begin to become real. Now make sure you get this. Make sure you grasp this. Jesus being raised from the dead means that God has begun to pour into our deadly and unjust and empty and hostile world God's peace and power to liberate us from those very forces. The presence of the risen Jesus means God's hoped-for age of peace has dawned. It means God's forgiveness is possible. Jesus' very presence heals and restores relationships. And through the risen Jesus, God begins to create a new humanity and ultimately the entire cosmos as Jesus breathes on his disciples and gives them new hearts and new minds. Remember when God breathed on Adam and Adam became a living being? In the same way, when Jesus breathes on his disciples and on us, he's now filling us with divine life and creating us and all things anew. You see, my friends, the resurrection is the most decisive event in human and cosmic history. But there's one thing I simply don't get. You see, when Jesus appeared in the upper room and he looked around and he said, "Oh, not these guys. Why didn't he leave and go somewhere else? Why did he stay?" These are the guys who denied him and betrayed him and fled as he was suffering and dying. Why did he choose to appear to them, of all people? Well, it seems that Jesus' resurrection not only frees him from death, but it frees him from resentment and bitterness and rage and revenge. All the things that the deadly age contained. You see, when he appears to them, his very presence establishes a new relationship between the disciples who betrayed him and Jesus. When he appears to them, his very presence is the act of forgiveness they needed. He frees them from their past and opens up for them a new future. His very presence embodies the peace, the shalom that he announces. He is the new age of peace. He didn't condemn them. If there was ever a time for condemnation, it would have been when he appeared to those guys. You don't hear a word about it. It's as if Jesus is incapable of condemnation or resentment or revenge. He's completely freed from it. Instead, he chooses to create a new community centered around him, starting with these guys. He decides to launch the new age of peace and give these guys new hearts and new minds. He begins God's new creation with them. And here, my friends, is the real good news for us. The risen Lord not only came to them, but he comes to us. He comes to us, he comes to you no matter what your past is. It doesn't matter to him. He comes to us when we're afraid and when we're lost and lonely. He comes to us in the midst of hostility and conflict when our relationships need to be healed and made whole. He comes offering God's peace. He comes breathing into our parish and into your lives, into your marriages and friendships, God's presence and power. So why come back to our Catholic community in St. John the Baptist? Why come back after you get your vaccine? There's really only one reason. Yes, we do come back to see each other. We come back for this wonderful music. We come back to see our priest and pastor. We come back for the Eucharist. But there's really only one reason. It's because the risen Lord is here with us. And he's offering us his joy and peace, filling this place and each of us with his Spirit and power. So here's my Easter message for you. My friends, make the risen Jesus and his life the center of your life. Make his peace and joy the center of your relationships. Ask him for that peace. Ask him for that freedom. Make him the center of your marriage and your family and your friendships and your experience of church. And I promise you, it will change your life. Just ask Thomas.